Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for being with us. Thank you for showing up in such large numbers. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the works of the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development, CIRSD. There was a little bit of a hiatus in the first half of 2017 because of some external distractions, if you will. But we're now back in the saddle, back in full force. And we are continuing with our mission, which is to bring the world closer to Serbia and Serbia to the world, to continue providing a platform for exchange of opinions and having an opportunity to welcome in our neck of the woods influential speakers and thinkers like the guest that we're having the privilege of hosting today. And today with us is George Friedman. Not the first time that George is with us in Belgrade as a guest of the CIRSD. He was the keynote speaker back in 2014 when we organized a special conference to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. So George is here for the second time. And he's one of the world's leading geopolitical analysts and strategic thinkers and forecasters. The author of several global bestsellers, to name a few: The Next 100 Years, The Next Decade, The Emerging Crisis in Europe from 2015, and I understand that his new book is forthcoming in 2018, which is The New American Century: Crisis, Endurance, and the Future of the United States. In 1996, George Friedman founded Stratfor, a private intelligence and consulting firm, and he served as its chairman until May 2015. Which is the year 2015 when he founded Geopolitical Futures, an online publishing service that had quickly established a global reputation as an indispensable tool for anyone who would like to understand the world of today and perhaps more importantly, the world of tomorrow. Last but not least, George is a double Horizons author. Horizons is the flagship publication magazine of our center. He published an essay in our inaugural issue in 2014 where he was comparing the geopolitics of 1914 with that of today. And in our forthcoming issue, which is coming out in September, George was also a distinguished author, and he wrote in that essay about Donald Trump, about his foreign policy, about the priorities and constraints for America's role in the world. And before we start this conversation, please join me in warmly welcoming George Friedman to Belgrade. So if you allow me, George, let's start with America. Let's start with your own country, the world's most powerful nation, which has been going through some interesting developments over the past year, 6 months as well. You are writing about Donald Trump in our next issue, but I'm not going to reveal any of your writing. But I'm going to start off by asking, what is going on in the power circles in America, and is the American presidency in jeopardy in the face of Russia investigation and other developments?
Well, I'm grateful to my British friends. Grateful to my British friends for creating an even stranger circumstance, or we can at least compete on which is strange. Let's begin with the fact that the United States is not a European country. And the structure of our government is not a European structure. Our founders created a system in which the president is probably the weakest leader in the Euro-American world. The most famous, the most visible. As Teddy Roosevelt said, he has a bully pulpit. But in the end, If his own party in Congress won't support him, which we are on certain domestic issues in that position, he can't do anything about it. And if a judge in Hawaii says that a program that he wanted to put in place moves against it, he can't. So we have to not confuse the President of the United States with the government of the United States, nor the government of the United States with the United States. As I like to tell my European friends, you've now visited Washington, why don't you take a chance to look at America? Because these are very different places and different sets of values. The United States now is socially and politically deeply divided. There are passionate enemies of Trump. There are passionate supporters of Trump. They hate each other. But it's on the wings, that passionate hatred. The country is divided, but most of it is, I'm much more interested in the football game than I am in that. So from looking at the newspapers, you can draw the conclusion that America is in chaos. If you visit me in Texas, you'll note that the subject may or may not come up, and not with a passion. The government continues to function as the founders wanted it to, badly. The founders did not want an efficient government. They divided into three parts with two houses of Congress, with states and everything. And therefore, the process of governing is complex. Add to that we're having an opera right now, howling and carrying on, carried out by both Trump himself and by the Washington Post, which is worth watching just to see how far you can go. But the country is still there. It is functioning independently. Houston is still pumping out oil, starting to sell it in the world markets. Google is still Googling, and everything else. We must distinguish the political crisis in the United States from the functioning of the government, in turn from the functioning of the country. In terms of foreign policy, there has actually been, aside from various bizarre statements at various points, great continuity in American foreign policy. We continue to want trade adjustments with the Chinese. This was the policy of the Obama administration. Of the Bush administration, this has been a long-standing issue. We continue to be engaged in the Middle East, perhaps changing some of the form, but that is still happening. We continue to support sanctions against the Russians. We continue to build up forces in Poland. We continue to build up forces in Romania. General Mattis was in Lithuania recently. So when you step back from all of the yelling, there are new issues on the horizon. We can talk about Korea and so on. But when you step aside from that, the really marked thing is the divergence between the rhetoric of the president and of the people who oppose him and the realities on the ground. Our foreign policy has remained intact, including the idea that we want the Europeans to participate in NATO. This has been a position of Barack Obama, whose own relations with Germany were not particularly good. There is, in foreign policy, more continuity. And so I think this kind of crisis could tear apart a parliamentary system. But in the United States, also undergirding all of this is the apparatchiks, the people who operate several levels below in every department, who, barring any systematic order, will continue to do so.
But there were some expectations here in this part of the world that Donald Trump is going to try and change an equation of a Russian-American relationship. So do you think that under his administration, or in this whole context that you had just described, America slowly, or if at all, changing its means and ways in foreign policy. Do you think that there is a way of America and Russia working together in the near future, or do you expect further frictions and deterioration of the relationship?
Well, I never understand what it means when you talk about countries working together. We have interests, we diverge, and so on. So if he had any intention of shifting the relationship with Russia, that's now gone. The Russians took care of that. If they involved themselves in some sort of operation to subvert Trump, it was revealed, and it blew up.
You mean to support Trump?
To support Trump, to bring him into office because there was some understanding. If, on the other hand, they had nothing to do with it, they were very clumsy in the way they expressed themselves, not nearly convincing enough. But in either case, a great deal of American foreign policy is, I think, I'm not in the government, I'm not in a closed room, I have no idea, but I have a sense, looking at it, is being carried out by General Mattis, Secretary Mattis. Secretary Mattis has certain interests. Those are particularly the places where we're fighting or might fight. His decision, with presidential approval or not, I don't know, to go to Lithuania was a signal to the Russians that our position was not changing. So whatever the perception, expectation of the Russians was that he was going to change it, I think he's lost the political room to maneuver. He doesn't have the capability of doing it. I'm not sure he ever really wanted to. But at any rate, the Republicans would rise against him, the Democrats would rise against him. There would be investigations all over the place. The last thing that the president right now needs is to be kind to the Russians.
And what that practically means in the context of Ukraine, for example?
Ukraine is now a frozen conflict. Both sides have achieved something they wanted to have. The Russians were appalled at the events of 2014 because they saw Ukraine as a critical buffer, which in the hands of the Western, if NATO deployed into there, any of this, would leave Russia in a seriously bad position. The Americans responded to Russian behavior in the Ukraine as potentially a precursor of aggressive actions further west. What we have now is essentially an agreement for the neutralization of Ukraine from a military standpoint. The Russians accept that the Ukrainian government may go in any direction it wants from a domestic economic point of view. They are not going to go farther than they have in supporting the Eastern Rising, which failed anyway. The Americans are very clear that they're not going to deploy major forces into Ukraine. We can't, they can't. So what we have is a situation where so long as nobody tries to reach a comprehensive agreement, we have what we want.
It's a frozen conflict, basically. But
it's more important than that. It is because we've left a bunch of questions unanswered that it works.
But is there a way of normalizing the economic and trade relationship with Russia with this issue of Ukraine, the way you described it, remaining frozen?
A great deal of that, the sanctions, have been superseded by a much more serious Russian problem, far more serious. $50 a barrel oil is insufficient to sustain the Russian budget. They have tried with the Saudis to raise the price. They have failed, in part because there is so much oil in the United States that the price naturally goes down, in part because the world is in stagnation economically and the demand for oil is low, and in part because the United States has now become a net exporter. So the world in which they plan their budget no longer works. They are trying very hard to figure out how to manage their system. And so for the Russians, the sanctions are a side issue at this point. They have much more fundamental questions. While the Russians are facing this crisis, okay, they will make gestures in various ways directed at their own population to convince them that the Russian government is still functioning, it is a great power, to build the morale. We must be very cautious not to overreact to those gestures. But also, at the moment, time is on our side with the Russians. Can we cooperate? Sure. The Russians have to come forward and set some proposals for what they want, things that are within our doing. I don't think there is a consensus between Russia and the Europeans and the European Union of what we want. So right now, I mean, there's sometimes the best thing to do with the conflict is let it go.
So speaking about the Europeans, you just mentioned them. Donald Trump came back from his first visit to Europe, and it wasn't universally regarded as a complete success by European allies, some of them at least.
I rather liked it.
Yeah. It was an interesting visit, and there were several moments that were captured by media, which some people considered priceless. But to be strategic about this, after the leader of the most powerful European country, Angela Merkel, says something along the lines, "We are now on our own. We have to find our own way." Sounds dramatic. That's perhaps part of the electoral rhetorics in the German political calendar, or not. But how do you see the relationship between United States and Europe, and its reflections on the future of NATO?
I think the fact that Angela Merkel said Europe must rely on itself makes this relationship actually possible. Because the American charge, which is not new to Trump, which goes back a long way, this goes like this. Europe now has the same GDP as the United States. The ratio of forces act like it's 1955. If there is going to be an alliance, the burden must be shared. Now, this has actually been American policy, not so operatically revealed as Trump did. But one of the things that was very funny to me is that I think Merkel thought that this would offend us. The idea that the Europeans will take responsibility for their own defense. This is what we have been asking for. This NATO relationship needs redefinition. The United States today has a war going in the Middle East. 16 years, good or bad. We have a crisis brewing in Korea. We also have a somewhat lonely outpost on the east in Romania and Poland. From the American point of view, these are the political realities in which we live, the military realities. It is not clear to us how NATO addresses this question. So we have our interests. The Europeans want NATO to remain focused on the basic principles that are outlined. It is there for defense against a Soviet assault. There's Article 5. It was invoked by the United States during Afghanistan. We received some help from the Europeans, some as much as they could, others far less than they could. When I worked at SHAPE Technical Center in NATO as a young child, we sat with the Germans, we sat with the Italians, we sat with the Belgians, and each of us understood what our country's mission was. Each of us understood what resources were being devoted, and we also understood the circumstances under which that would happen. There is no longer that consensus. I've not been in SHAPE Technical Center for a long time, but I will guess that there is many important subjects being swept under the rug. We speak of Euro-American civilization, and I take that very seriously. This alliance was formed in the early 1950s. It is now more than half a century old. The world has transformed. If we want a military alliance within the Euro-American civilization, then we must define it in terms of what the world is now. And I won't run through the differences, but the Soviet Union collapsed. We can start with that. So I think the real issue between both sides is the Americans have the will to have this discussion. The Europeans don't want to have that will because it would cause them to engage in military activities they really don't want to engage in, and it's not in their interest. And I think Donald Trump's one virtue, and he doesn't have many, but he has this one: he will slam the issue on the table. And I rather liked, the response. The idea that Europe will now be responsible for its own defense is exactly what the American position has been. Now, that means go build tanks, go do this. I don't care about 2%. I believe in armored formations.
Well, that's a very interesting point of view, the fact that actually Merkel said what America wanted to hear. That's
what I wanted to hear. I don't speak for America.
That's a very interesting angle. But speaking about Europe, Europe obviously is a very big topic here in the Balkans, and there's been a push on behalf of Serbia for the past, I'd say, 15, 16, 17 years to join the European Union. But now we see some crucial developments, and some call it crisis, and some call it multiple crises in the European space. Brexit and the Euro crisis, and the refugee crisis, and how it shaped up the European political architecture and landscape. What is you're a great forecaster. What's your forecast for Europe, near term and midterm, say?
Well, you have to begin by taking a look at the massive difference between the Europe we spoke of 10 years ago and what we face now. The delta, the change in the issues is dramatic and stunning. And it does not seem to me that the process that took us here is slowing down. Europe has three components, the European Union. Let's not confuse that with Europe. The European Union has three components. One is the free trade zone. Germany is at the center of the free trade zone. It exports 50% of its GDP. The fourth largest economy in the world depends on exports for 50% of its GDP. At the center of NAFTA is the United States, a net importer. How does a free trade zone operate with a group of countries of various ranges of development, various cultures, various types, when one country is so dependent on that free trade zone? The second thing is the euro. How do we price the euro? How does the European Central Bank price it? Well, by the net total of the European economy, its interest. But Germany outweighs this massively as this fourth. And so it always winds up in a situation that it's priced to maximize, to deal with two fears of the Germans. One is inflation and unemployment. The other is to make certain that exports can go on. This means that other countries may have suboptimally priced. Now, Eastern Europe has done very well. I think one of the reasons was it's not in the Eurozone mostly, except for Slovakia, for reasons I don't understand. But they have done, look at the numbers coming out of Romania, look at the numbers coming out of Eastern Europe, and it's really a startling difference. The third thing is Brussels. So Brussels issues decisions. Now, the foundation of liberal democracy is national self-determination. Without national self-determination, all the other rights and everything don't function. And the heart of national self-determination is accountability. There are many different nations. Who will you be accountable to? Giving the best credit to all of the technocrats in Brussels, who do they answer to? They answer to a very complex entity, and frequently the voices aren't heard. A free trade zone, even with Germany in the position it is, made a great deal of sense. That could work. Comparing NAFTA to what happened, we had much fewer countries. We didn't try to create a super government, and we didn't try to peg the peso and the dollar together. So Europe was an enormously ambitious undertaking. which now faces the fact that there's a reason there are nations, and it's very hard to calibrate. How do you calibrate this entity? And the simplest way that I would put it is been 9 years since 2008, and Southern Europe still has catastrophic unemployment rates. Okay? When I speak to the Europeans, they're saying I have to be patient. To which my answer is, I don't have to be anything. I live in Texas. I don't have to be patient. The European countries have to be patient. And along the periphery, there is a process that's been going on slowly in 10 years. Brexit was part of it. It is not a hatred of Europe. It is trying to find how they position themselves in this incredibly complex system of which they don't really have control. Nor can they, because the system can't serve everyone. So my forecast is, I believe some form of the free trade zone will continue to exist. The two-speed Europe, where you have different, may well be it, or I would put it this way, the free trade zone will break up and there'll be 2 blocks, and they will define their own.
You mean the North and the South?
Whatever the Europeans decide. I mean, the point here is that Europe won't decide for all the Europeans. It can't. The second thing is, I don't know how you back out of the euro. I mean, how does a country whose debt is entirely in the euro, denominated in euro, back out without a massive default? It's complex. It could be done possibly, but it hasn't been done yet. Then there's the question of what about this super government? Does it make the decision on a range of things, including immigration? Who makes these decisions? Who decides that? Who can block that? Who can veto that? You have a constitution that goes on for many, many pages. Ours goes on for very few. But it's very clear who gets to decide things and how. So from my point of view, in the long run, Europe is a magnificent place. The European Union is a majestic experiment. It was perhaps too ambitious, and I think under the force of all of the sequentially unhappy European countries, because not all at the same time, it will have to be dialed back if it's 5.
So what does that practically means for, say, Serbia and the Western Balkans that are the nearest possible neighborhood of the European Union, with the ongoing aspiration to join whatever we might be seeing in front of us?
Well, I mean, there are 2 sides to this equation. What, the Europeans don't have enough problems? They should integrate the Balkans? The second question is, you don't have enough problems? You should be integrated into the EU? I mean, it is not self-evident that you will flourish in the EU. And let's bear in mind, there's a difference in Slovenia and Albania, and the region is complex and fragmented. So there's no answer to all of you. But this is like the Montenegro problem. Montenegro is now in NATO. My country is now legally bound to defend Montenegro. How did we get into that? What is Montenegro doing in NATO? What was the point? We have to stop thinking about the way we used to think about it. We used to think about, if we were European, we were part of NATO, we were part of EU. And it was for a region that had been under Soviet domination. The idea that I was free of the Soviets, now what am I? NATO and the EU gave the region a meaning. This is what you were. And everybody wanted it. Now, after the symbolism, you get down to the work, and that's hard.
But it looks decreasingly likely that this process is going to accelerate. And what we currently have in Serbia is a departure from, that's my opinion, is a departure from European standards and some of the basic values that bounded together the European Union, the rule of law and the freedom of speech included. Now, in this vacuous situation, politically and institutionally, we see, like in other parts of the European continent, resurgences of political populism. And in the Balkans, this is something that has rarely, if ever, ended well. And here in this country, we are particularly concerned about the reviving of prospects of so-called Greater Albania, which is now being loudly championed by certain Albanian leaders throughout the ethnic Albanian space across various countries. What do you make out of it, and should we be worried about it?
Well, I would look at it two ways. When I was in Romania, Hungary, Poland, I was very surprised because up to this point, the conversation has always been about Russia. They had been obsessed with Russia and so on. This time there was an undertone of something else, Turkey. The question of whether Turkey represents it. And it's been particularly focused on the Balkans. You know, what is happening in the Balkans? How do we manage the Balkans and so on? So the first thing is that Albania should be looked at in the Turkish context. I have not reached any conclusion of whether Turkey at this point is in a position to be influencing the Balkans seriously, but other countries are thinking about it. If that's true, then it becomes a European problem. It becomes a European problem if Albania is under Turkish influence and Turkey intends something that we can't anticipate and so on. Outside of that, I think there's a broader question that really has to be answered. The time since the collapse of Yugoslavia has not been, in general, a happy time for the Balkans. It has had a terrible war. It has had to recover from this terrible war, and now it's searching for itself. I think integrating yourself in the EU would cause complexities that you should expect, and as the man who should have been, in my opinion, head of the UN, Secretary General, you should be prudent in what you do, okay? I think what used to be a no-brainer is no longer a no-brainer. I am much more interested in the impossible, a federation of the Balkans, where countries don't like each other, get together and understand that if there's going to be a bloc here, it has to be a bloc of relatively equals pursuing relatively equal interests. Now you raised the question of populism. And with the question of populism comes the question of nationalism, and that in the Balkans has always been just beneath the surface. But if the Balkans becomes another cockpit of suspicion, what the Albanians are doing, what the Croatians are doing, and so on, no outside power can handle this. Now, I see no movement toward this, and I think the entire discussion of Europe is an attempt to evade the problem. You don't solve yourself in Europe. You solve yourself by recognizing that one of the best times in your history was when you were Yugoslavia, regardless of the oppressive communist regime, or not oppressive, or whatever, that you have things in common, and those things in common are of mutual benefit. Now, if you can't do that, then you have problems. Now, I don't have problems, you have problems. So it seems to me that the people in this region must make a very painful choice. I'm Hungarian, and my mother raised me to hate all Romanians who had stolen Hungary and bespoiled it. I've managed to overcome this. She's my mother, I loved her, but this is silly, okay? In the same way, whatever went before for all these years, I think I urge the Balkans to consider an option that does not require that you align yourself with European interests. You are not the Netherlands, you are not Italy, okay? And you have common interests, and I don't expect you to do this, and I'm not a policymaker, so I certainly don't forecast it.
That's a very, very, very interesting view. I'm sure that there are going to be some follow-up questions on this from the audience, but you did mention Turkey and the role of Turkey. So what do you make out of the future trajectory of Turkey under the new, I'd say, enhanced leadership of the president, and its quite a singular role that it plays in the Middle East, but more in the Balkan context?
Turkey is going to be the major regional power because of its geography, its population, and a range of other things. It has gone through a terrible time now, and it is easy to write Turkey off. I would remind everybody that the United States in 1865 had gone through a civil war of 600,000 dead. 35 years later, we produced half of the manufactured goods in the world. In other words, do not assume that instability always means collapse. What I think has happened in Turkey is Erdogan forcing a kind of national recognition that there is a secular heartland in Istanbul. It is also a Muslim country. Ataturk's solution, which was it would be a civilian country, it would be a country that military reinforced its basic principles by intervening, that's unsustainable. So they have some very hard work to do. But they sit at a table now with the Russians and the Americans, not quite unequal, but quite difficult. They have interests, they pursue them. They are very cautious not to do the things the United States wants them to do. They are prepared to tell the Russians to back off. As we go forward, we should remember that when the Arab world, if I could put it that way, was pacified, one of the periods was the Ottoman Empire. The Arabs do not remember it happily, but the Ottomans were effective. The Black Sea was once an Ottoman sea, and Crimea was occupied by them. The Balkans, all the way up to Vienna and Budapest. That same country is there again. Now, will it achieve that sort of thing? Not very quickly, not very easily. But it is the indispensable country. We Americans like to call the United States the indispensable country. I never understand what it means, but we like to say that. Turkey is the indispensable country. We can fight all we want, but until the Turks decide to take the risk of joining, we're not going to settle the issue. So my forecast for Turkey is that you can like it, you cannot like it, it is going to be a great power. It will be involved in the Balkans, and the best way to help them is to remain fragmented.
That's a very, very interesting view. And now the next, I would say, logical flight of questions, having spoken about Turkey, would be the Middle East and the ongoing deterioration of the Sykes-Picot agreement, and currently there seems to be a great crisis in the Gulf going on with the Qatar blockade. But before I swing to the Middle East, I wanted to raise one of the issues that you spoke of recently, and I was personally surprised when I read your about your thinking, and that's to do with the Far East, and that is to do with the Korean Peninsula. That seems to be very far away from us here, but is definitely at the center of gravity of international trade and economy. There've always been tensions and problems with the North Korean leadership. But recently, there seemed to be quite a I'd say, dangerous dynamics, and with the American administration, with Donald Trump's statements and the Chinese reaction. What do you make out of the current situation in North Korea? Is there a danger of a war? And if there's a war, God forbid, in the future, who will be fighting this war?
Well, yes, there's a danger. The policy of the United States going back into the Bush administration has been consistent, which is we will not tolerate North Korea acquiring nuclear weapons and ICBMs. We will not accept the idea that it will be their decision whether or not to destroy an American city. Okay. This view was made clear to the North Koreans. The North Koreans seem to feel they need nuclear weapons to guarantee their regime, that the United States won't do anything. We've had a fairly unpleasant, stable relationship. Back in around February, it became apparent that North Korea had entered an area where it may well be moving toward the ability to strike the United States. And that was the acquisition of a rocket with solid fuel as opposed to liquid fuel. Liquid fuel can be seen, it takes a while to load and you can spot it from a satellite. Solid fuel, if, is good to go. They don't have that capability now. But as General Mattis put it, we're not going to wait till they have this capability. So there is a red line, and it's not a new one with the Trump administration. It may be that the North Koreans chose to cross that line because they misread the Trump administration. As part of this process, the United States has deployed substantial systems. 3 aircraft carriers in the region, Guam with its B-2, B-1s, and B-52 bombers, forces in Japan, forces in South Korea. This is not a simple thing. You don't simply take out their equipment because they have artillery that has all of Seoul in reach. And that's 25 million people that they could bring under artillery attack. And those have to be taken out, and that is a very complex military problem that I won't go into here. No need for that. We have also asked the Chinese, and the Chinese have agreed to serve as an intermediary to persuade the North Koreans to back off the place they're in right now. I have from everything that I hear, which is very little, that the Chinese are still trying to achieve some sort of understanding with the North Koreans. If they do, Donald Trump, in one of his famous tweets, said that we will offer significant concessions on trade issues. I love that man. Any other administration would have offered that, but never admitted it. This guy tweets it. It's wonderful. So there is certainly a motivation, I think, for the Chinese. Now, can the Chinese not only get the North Koreans to make this concession, but make it in such a way that inspection is possible? Trusting North Korea is not a major thing that we're going to do. If I were to bet, the answer is no. I may be wrong, but my bet is that the Chinese cannot.
So is your bet that actually there is going to be a war?
If the Chinese fail, Mattis has made it clear 2 things. One, the war would be catastrophic. It was the term he used. And the second was that we would go. That we will not wait till they have an ICBM.
So are we talking here months or years?
Well,
so the Chinese keep trying, and let's say that they keep trying and they keep basically stalling, well, not stalling, not being able to deliver from the North Korea the kind of, I'd say, guarantees that America would be happy with. So are you talking months or years or more, if nothing changes, that we could expect actually a first military strike by the United States?
I'm working with newspaper clippings, not intelligence. But as I see this developing, we are already in that position of danger. The United States does not deploy 2 or 3 aircraft carriers as a gesture. It is a very difficult and expensive thing to do. They're serious. The Americans are serious. The Americans have been in the same position before Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. We go, we position ourselves, we make it clear that we will accept a capitulation or even a negotiation, and when we don't get it, it goes. Now the question is how long? Well, if we have already entered, and I believe we have entered the zone where the North Koreans could surprise us, it has to be sooner rather than later. Nothing will be a more unpleasant surprise than to discover that we underestimated their abilities. In the intelligence community, they are undoubtedly looking at everything. The president's problem, Mattis's problem, is the intelligence community is wrong frequently. So how much of a risk do we take? And I would argue that we can't keep 3 carrier battle groups on station forever. We can't keep everybody on alert forever. I don't know what understanding there is with the Chinese over reporting to the United States status, or whether the Chinese will take the responsibility of saying they failed. But this cannot go on for years. It cannot, in my mind, go on for months. It is either we accept that they have an ICBM, or we take a step, or they accept the idea that we will act, and it will be up to the Chinese, I hope, to convince them that we're not joking.
So, but like, if there's like a unilateral strike on North Korea, and you just mentioned that there is an artillery capability and probably some nuclear short-range capability on behalf of North Korea, I mean, they're not going to sit still. They're going to retaliate probably towards South Korea. Are we then looking into a conflict of global proportions in case Chinese fail to deliver the guarantees?
I don't see global proportions. It's the U.S. against Korea. But look, I mean, the war begins, if I'll guess, with attacks on the artillery positions. Now, the artillery positions, unfortunately, are protected very well by anti-aircraft systems, including the equivalent of the Russian S-300, which means that our bombers would all be in danger from those. So the first thing we have to do is take out the air defense system. And we have aircraft called Wild Weasels, only an American could have a name for that go in, trigger the radar, and try to destroy it. That will take several days at very best. During that time, the North Koreans have the option of firing them. Once those are out of there, it will be area bombardment by strategic bombers over these. Anytime you ask the military, the war will be over in 2 weeks. Paul Wolfowitz guaranteed that about Iraq. We're still pulling duty in Iraq.
Yeah, but that abstracts away the China's reaction.
Well, China's reaction will be either to go to war on North Korea's behalf, which we can't imagine them doing, or accepting the idea that under no circumstances will the United States accept the North Korean government having a nuclear capability against the United States. And if that makes somebody unhappy, we'll be much more unhappy if Los Angeles disappears. We do not trust the stability or even sanity of the North Korean government. And therefore, I will make the argument that the president allowing them to achieve nuclear capabilities against the United States, I mean, he may be impeached anyway. That would get him pretty close.
All right. What looks as a far more, I would say, pulsating hotspot right now that also involves various strategic interests and capabilities, and there is a religious and sectarian element to it, is the blockade of Qatar, the crisis in the Gulf,
and everything that could emanate out of it, speaking about energy markets, speaking about global peace and security. What's the background behind the escalation of the relations in the Gulf?
Well, I think the first thing that's behind it is we've been fighting this war for 16 years. We haven't been winning. And the definition of insanity is to continue doing what we're doing. So the crisis really was that I think, if you ask General Mattis, I never have, he's looking at this and saying, this is stupid. Why should we do this? I think that the basic issue here has always been we did not have a broad-based coalition in the Arab world to support us. We were essentially floating in the air. So on the one hand, we would be engaged in military operations against very small groups. On the other hand, there would be a degree of cooperation from one country or another country to a certain point, but not a coalition dedicated to the elimination of ISIS. I suspect that these countries are told, we will leave if you do not join in. I mean, if you don't cast your lot, take the risks with us. We've lost 7,000 soldiers. We're not going to lose any more in a war we can't win. Make your decision. Now, I think what emerged from this, it was partly delivered, I suspect, by the president, was a realization that Saudi Arabia may well face ISIS alone without the United States taking responsibility for defending it. So this was, I think, a sobering thought for many of these countries. Okay. I'm not sure what it had to do with Qatar. According to what I read in the newspaper, Qatar was signaled out by the United States as having supported ISIS and also in some way having supported Iran. I don't, however, see this, I would think that Qatar sees this as a particular crisis about them. I see this as part of a crucial confrontation between the United States, which is essentially losing a war and certainly not winning it, and people who are putatively its allies who are not prepared to take risks.
But if you're speaking from really American perspective.
Mm-hmm.
If you go and talk to the people in the Middle East and go throughout the Arab world, and if you ask them a question like, who is the greater danger to peace and stability? Is it ISIS and its offshoots, or is it perhaps Iran? I found it that surprisingly many have said actually it is Iran and not ISIS. So from your perspective, who is really the main threat? I mean, who is the bigger threat? Is it Sunni Iran
to whom?
Or ISIS? To the Middle Eastern peace and stability at this very moment.
To the Middle East, you would argue that both are a threat. You don't go to war with both at the same time unless you need to, and you don't need to. From my point of view, my biggest threat as an American is that my country is fighting to stabilize a region when those who are the governments of this region have mixed feelings about everything we do. It is impossible for the United States, with the amount of forces it has available, to operate a successful war. So from their point of view, it may be an interesting discussion of whether ISIS or Iran is the greater danger. From our point of view, we're fighting ISIS. You're with us, or you're not with us, let us know what you want. But their crisis is that if they continued the way they were, I think the United States would eventually, or not too quickly, not too slowly, leave. We can't win the war. Now, Saudi Arabia, UAE, others had to make a decision. Do they want to be in the Middle East where they have to take whatever actions they can without the United States? So one of the mistakes I think the United States constantly makes is it looks at the world through the eyes of its allies. The United States in this particular case has to look at the world through its own eyes and what it's doing, and ask the question, how much longer can we do this? And then the allies must take a look at the world through American eyes and realize that this is really not going to go on. Now, if they want to form an expeditionary force to fight Iran, it's fine. But it's always the question of, is Iran or ISIS the biggest threat, and when will the United States take care of it? And what we're saying is, yes, we'll accept the idea that we have fought this war, it probably was a mistake, doesn't matter, we're there. Do we have a coalition behind us or don't we?
And do you think that the way you were coloring the picture in this ongoing prevarication of the Arab allies, but also of America trying to decide whether it wants to leave or not, there is an ongoing catastrophe in Syria, which is on the Mediterranean shores, and our part of the world in Europe in general have felt through the waves of refugees, have gone through lots of political, I'd say, locomotions as a result of this crisis. And of course the issue of Islamist extremism in Europe is not unrelated to that. For the end, before I give the floor to the audience, how do you see the war in Syria, or whatever you're going to call it right now, how does it end? Does it end at all? And what it takes for this to be ended?
End. I don't see a Syria war separate any longer from the general war that's waged between the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Ocean. This is now one general problem, crisis. It's complicated by the fact that the Russians chose to intervene, but could not bring anything to conclusion. It is complicated by the fact that there are so many factions fighting. It is complicated by the fact that there's a refugee crisis that comes from this. There's nothing not complicated in this region. And after 16 years, we have seen every complexity that you can find. All right? So, somebody asked me, what does this do for a refugee crisis in Europe? And, you don't want to have a refugee crisis in Europe, why don't you send some troops and clean up the situation in Syria?
You mean Europeans?
Shocking, yes. They don't want to see. Look, the point I'm making here is that the United States, regardless who had won the presidency, would be recalibrating its position in the world. We're overextended, we're engaged in endless conflicts in the Middle East. We have crises emerging at various points that we didn't want and didn't expect. And from the American point of view, we feel quite alone coping with this. We'll cope with it. But then the world expects us to take them into consideration. Well, I had my daughter spend 2 tours in Iraq with the 1st Cavalry Division as an intelligence officer. My son's in the Air Force. And I take very personally the fact that we're alone. So this is not meant to be America the cowboy or anything else. We're losing this war. We need help or we won't win. We're not going to stay there and lose any more people. Very personal stuff, what people we're talking about. Okay? So we're not going to do that. Now, given the fact that our only alternative is to leave, who will help us? So when I look at the Europeans and I say, you mean the Europeans? Yes. Our allies. Who are our allies? Who are our friends? Who share the burden? What I think happened in the Middle East was a coalition that sort of pledged to share the burden. The gutter issue, I think I don't understand nearly well enough to have any opinion on what really happened there and why that was selected. But I can say that from the American point of view, this was a remarkable show of Arab unity, and we welcomed it. Now, let them also do something.
Well, I I'm not seeing imminent moves in Europe when it comes to being prepared to
Nor I.
to make a stronger security and military contribution to the completion of the hostilities in Syria, or cessation of hostilities in Syria. But we opened up so many questions and issues, and we tried to look at the whole world. There are some 20 more minutes left according to our initial schedule, and our usual way of ending conversations with a distinguished guest is to allow audience to ask questions. So allow me to be the moderator of that too. Are there any questions for our distinguished guests?
No, I'm going home.
There's one question, and then over there. Mr. Ambassador. Ambassador of Ukraine.
Does it work? Yes. Alexander Alexandrovich, Ambassador of Ukraine. Thank you so much, George and Vuk, for the excellent presentation. Indeed, you covered the whole world, but you took each problem individually in each separate region. My question is, what happens if, for example, this autumn, by accident or by design, all these problems converge? In North Korea, in the Middle East, with the Russian exercise in Belarus, with Germany in the middle of the elections. How can we cope with all of them at the same time? And can the United States take the lead?
We can't cope with all that at the same time. We won't cope with it. So the question will be to the government of Ukraine, what do you propose? We're open. Look, the United States is an overwhelming power. It is not an omnipotent power. It cannot solve every problem, relieving the world for the responsibility of engaging. To converge all these things also requires a force on the other side who is capable of doing that. The obvious candidate for this is Russia, who I don't see as nearly that competent. Russia failed to prevent the loss of Ukraine from its sphere of influence. There is kind of an idea that Russia has unique covert capabilities, and that was probably true under Stalin, but it's been a long time since Stalin. There is no force that can coordinate all of these entities together and be invisible. I think the real question of the world that we will be facing is an old one of collective security. The question of collective security was Roosevelt's attempt after the end of World War II to create a coalition of victors, the United Nations, that would take responsibility for the world. The one event that we had something like that was Korea, I should say. But it was also a coalition of the willing. Okay. What we need to do is either so think of it this way. In World War II, we emerged with three principles: multilateralism, interdependence, technocratic government. Okay? We've reached a point here where those have broken down. Is it any one country's fault? No. The entire system was too burdensome, too complex. And burden sharing is only something that someone who wants somebody else to do something wants. Institutions that emerged from World War II, like the IMF, like Bretton Woods, like NATO, no longer address the problems. We keep them alive because it is easier to keep them alive than to face the fact that we have to restructure them. NATO does not affect any of the crises that we talked about. It's not involved. It's not their area of responsibility. Now, there is an opportunity here for the world to understand that it must act collectively. One way to do this is for the United States to refuse to act. There are things we must act on. Korea, that's our problem. You don't feel it's a problem, it's your problem. There are other areas that we can only act collectively on. Middle East. Now, the problem is we have no common understanding of what our mutual interest is. So this probably isn't going to happen. But if it's not going to happen, the United States must focus its risk-taking in areas that matter to the United States. We cannot guarantee everyone's happiness. And we don't. And we usually do a terrible job trying to do it. So we shouldn't even start it. I mean, one war we shouldn't have started the way we did was the Middle East. And we don't know how to end it. That's our problem. But, you know, when I look at the question of the Balkans, once again, the question of collective responsibility and coordination comes up. Once again, we are in a position where we have to ask that question. And everybody answers that question, that's not possible. And then looks to an American and says, what are you going to do about it? So I think the challenge to all of us in this room is, if we really believe that the United States should not be the imperialist giant, and I'm for that, let us consider how we do this collectively.
Any other questions? Sir, and then, okay. Microphone for the gentleman.
My name is Cedo, I'm a journalist, specialized in security matters. My question is, what is a greater danger for Serbia and region? Our presidents in region or terrorist threat? That's it, that's all.
I think the greatest danger to this region is this region. Terrorism is a problem, and I certainly can't minimize it, but it's so far not an existential threat. We will live through that. There are some threats that we may not live through, but the whole question is, what do we owe each other? So, as you finish it, I will go back to the point that I'm making on the Balkans. If you're your own worst threat, you're your own solution.
There was another question from there.
Hello. Thank you for coming to Belgrade, Mr. Friedman, and also Mr. Jeremić. Thank you for inviting Mr. Friedman. I have two questions. One is about Kosovo. I would like to know, do you see any gains that Serbia can get from Trump's presidency regarding Kosovo? And second question is, where do you see Serbia in 10 years from now? Whether it would be part of western part of the influence, or Russian, or somewhere in between. Thank you very much.
If you are thinking, let me just answer the first question, the second question first. Where you will be right here. And right to the north of you is Romania, and to the north of Romania is Hungary, and to the north of Hungary is Poland, and this is the most vibrant region in Europe right now. And I believe that it is the heartland of Europe for the next 2 generations. Because I see Germany and Netherlands have reached a peak, if you will. How much better can you get given circumstances? The creativity of this region, the intellectual capabilities of its citizens, the high level of education, coupled by the fact that I can hire an Estonian cheap for doing my IT work. This is the region that's alive with possibility. You see yourself as separate from Eastern Europe. I see you as the southern extension of Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, there are all sorts of things getting in the way of cooperation. I mentioned one, the Hungarian question of Romania. They asked me what the United States will do, and I said, I can tell you from the bottom of my heart, the United States doesn't care. Leave me alone. And that takes care of my Kosovo question. What I am saying here is, you are not part of Austria. You are not part of Central Europe. You are part of Eastern Europe, and that makes you very fortunate. Because in Serbia, in Croatia, in Slovenia, you have an incredible pool of intellectual talent. I know of no other place in the world that I can buy knowledge at such a low cost. Now, this is not criticizing you. I like you having a very low cost. But soon, you will not have such a low cost. And that will build you. No amount of government work, no amount of coalition building in Europe is going to take the place of the fact that this is the region that is alive with minds. Now, if you stop thinking in terms of your last war, which wasn't very good, and I'd skip it if I were you, and start thinking about how do you free up those minds that are here in Serbia? How do you link into the networks of business to your north? I mean, here you have, I think, the solution that's crying out for you. And the only thing that can stand in your way is you. I mean, if you insist on one way I would put it is this. In the United States, we worry about Mexico. Somebody comes to me and offers me business from Mexico that I can make a lot of money on. I'll live with Mexico. It is amazing what success does to nationalism. So I would really ask you to take a look at yourselves. Who are you like? You're more like Romania, in my eyes, or Hungary, or these countries, than you are like Austria or Italy or those countries. So I would ask you to look at yourselves in that context and begin demanding the institutional opportunities that should be yours.
The second question was
and for
Kosovo.
my next dance.
There was a first question of the gentleman. It was
Yeah, I
about
was trying to
Kosovo.
blow by it, so
Do you
I
blow
would
by
know.
it?
He wanted me I didn't want to be rude and say I don't care what happens to Kosovo, but all right, I don't care. I do care what happens to the Balkans. I want a powerful Balkans that can stand against both Russia and Turkey, that can be a partner of the United States. I'm not interested in what divides you. I'm interested in what makes you powerful. And from an American point of view, and the American government probably wouldn't speak this way, the world is changing. There's stuff going on to the south, stuff going on to the north. You need to focus down and become rich.
There's time for one last question. Over there. One last question.
Good evening. My name is Sasha Rangelovic. I'm just here on behalf of myself, not representing anybody or anyone. I have a twofold question. The first one, actually, going back to your description of your presentation of Mr. Donald Trump's visit, his first visit to Europe, and the fallout of that visit. I would like to ponder on the notion that back in 2003, the then Defense Secretary, Mr. Donald Rumsfeld, referred to Europe old versus new. That notion, is it still viable, or has it been swept under the rug? And the second part of my question actually deals with the conflict in Syria. Do you believe that the Russian involvement in Syria is a revenge for the abysmal defeat of its of the then Soviet technology back in 1967 by the IDF? Thank you very much.
So, on the first question, yes, I believe the idea of New Europe is right, and I just described it to you. This is the New Europe. I don't use that phrase because Donald Rumsfeld used it, and I don't use any phrase that Donald Rumsfeld used. But, yeah, this is hard for Europeans to see. But I see a vibrance in this region, intellectually, that diverges from your politics in every country. And I see your politics blocking your development. But if you can move away from political institutions where I go to Romania to do business and I have to go to a ministry. I don't want to, why should I go to a ministry to do business?
Here you don't have to go to a ministry, you have to go to a certain other place. But there's the same concept.
So let me finish the question about Syria. Is it all right if I finish?
Yeah.
Okay. On the question of Syria, the Russians didn't do anything in Syria. They sent 150 fighters. Half the time, only half were available. Most of the time, only half were available. They took Aleppo. Okay, now what did they do with Aleppo? If this was revenge, this is the only kind of revenge I want to see. The Russians went to Syria for the Russian people to see them going to Syria. Look at us, we are here with the Americans. What they achieved was minimal. Now they don't know how to get out any more than we know how to get out. The only thing they've learned from America is how to get into a conflict that I can't get out of. So they will stay there. But there was no revenge. No one felt, oh my God, the Russians have come, now they've taken over the country. They've taken over nothing. They're one other faction in a civil war in which they have no interest. So look at the Russians, ask me what strategic goal they had and why they care if Assad lives or dies. And then you'll understand that the point of this war was domestic political. Russia is in trouble at home and must show itself to be a great power.
Well, on this note, I would like to wholeheartedly thank all of you for joining us this evening, and thank George for this inspiring and provocative discussion. I'd like to say that there is more to come from CIRSD before the summer break. In July, we're hoping to hold public discussions on the future of Europe, with the participation of European speakers and that from the region as well as Russia. And then towards the end of July, there's going to be a discussion on the Middle East. We're going to have guests from America and from Russia. In September, we're publishing the new issue of Horizons, and George Friedman's piece on Donald Trump and his foreign policy is going to be one of key contributions, and we're also publishing I'd say a seminal biography book of late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, with the participation of a range of distinguished speakers from the region. With this, I invite you all to thank my guest and to thank our guest, and also to join us at the cocktail just outside. Thank you.